October 14, 1943, 22,000 feet above Rabaul. Hauptmann Erich Müller adjusted his oxygen mask and scanned the sky below through his Messerschmitt's canopy. 47 Allied aircraft had fallen to his guns, and today felt like the day for number 48. His experienced eyes caught the glint of metal far below, a twin-boomed shape that made his pulse quicken with anticipation. A P-38 Lightning, flying alone and seemingly unaware of the death approaching from above. Müller pushed his control stick forward and felt the familiar surge of his fighter diving toward what appeared to be easy prey. The American pilot below maintained steady course and speed, completely oblivious to the German ace descending like a hawk upon a rabbit. At this altitude and angle, the Lightning pilot would never see him coming until the first cannon shells tore through his aircraft. Müller had executed this exact attack pattern dozens of times, and it never failed to deliver swift victory. His finger found the firing button as he closed to optimal range, the twin-boomed aircraft growing larger in his gunsight with each passing second. Then something impossible happened. For more P-38 Lightnings materialized from empty air, rising from cloud cover like ghosts emerging from fog. They moved with precision that defied every law of aerial combat Müller had learned in 5 years of war. The lone Lightning he had been stalking suddenly banked hard left, while 2 others climbed to bracket his position from either side. A 4th Lightning dove from above, while the 5th maneuvered to cut off his escape route. Within seconds, Müller found himself surrounded by a coordinated formation that moved like dancers following choreography he could not hear. The lead American pilot's voice crackled through the radio frequency with crystal clarity that made Müller's blood freeze. "Bandit at your 6, Lucky. Break right and climb. Thunder 3, take high cover. Thunder 4, swing wide and get behind him." The transmission was so clear it sounded like the pilot was sitting next to Müller in his cockpit. German radio communications never achieved such clarity, usually dissolving into static and garbled fragments that forced pilots to rely on hand signals and visual cues during combat. Müller's wingman Hans Richter was diving to support the attack when tracer rounds from 2 different P-38s converged on his position with mathematical precision. The young pilot never had time to radio for help or even scream before his Messerschmitt exploded in a ball of orange flame that scattered burning debris across 3,000 feet of sky. The Americans had not fired randomly or desperately. They had calculated angles, predicted flight paths, and executed a trap with the cold efficiency of a factory machine. Banking hard right to avoid the same fate as his wingman, Müller found himself caught in a tactical formation he had never encountered before. The P-38s weaved back and forth in a pattern that kept one aircraft always firing while another maneuvered for position. When he turned to engage one Lightning, another appeared in his blind spot. When he climbed to gain altitude, they climbed with him in perfect coordination. When he dove to escape, they anticipated his move and cut him off before he could build separation. The American pilots continued their radio chatter with the casual professionalism of factory workers discussing production schedules. "Thunder 2, he's turning into you. Drop down and give him something to think about. Thunder 5, maintain altitude and watch for more bandits." Their voices carried no emotion, no excitement, no fear. They spoke like men who knew exactly what would happen next because they had done this dance many times before. Müller's own radio produced nothing but static and interference. He could not coordinate with other German pilots, could not call for backup, could not even warn his squadron about the sophisticated tactics being used against them. The Luftwaffe's radio equipment had always been unreliable, but now that weakness had become a death sentence. He was fighting blind while his enemies shared perfect information in real time. Cannon shells from the Lightning behind him stitched across his right wing, punching holes through aluminum and severing control cables. Müller pushed his throttle to maximum power and dove toward the clouds, using every trick he had learned in 5 years of aerial combat. The P-38s did not pursue with the desperate aggression he expected. Instead, they maintained their formation and let him escape with the patient confidence of hunters who knew their prey was already wounded. As Müller limped back toward base with his damaged Messerschmitt trailing smoke and fuel, one terrible truth burned in his mind like acid. The Americans possessed something the Luftwaffe did not understand: something that transformed individual pilots into components of a larger machine. They were no longer fighting knights in single combat. They were fighting a connected enemy that shared eyes, ears, and thoughts across vast distances of sky. 2 years earlier, in a cramped laboratory at Bell Telephone Laboratories in Murray Hill, New Jersey, engineer Robert Chen stared at the radio prototype that would change the course of aerial warfare forever. The morning of December 8, 1941, brought news of Pearl Harbor and transformed his experimental communications project into a matter of national survival. Chen had been working on aircraft radio systems for civilian aviation, but now military officials crowded into his workshop demanding immediate solutions to give American pilots every possible advantage against enemies who had been preparing for war while America slept. The challenge seemed impossible at first glance. Existing aircraft radios were primitive devices that barely functioned under ideal conditions and completely failed during the stress of combat. Most fighter planes carried radio equipment that could transmit clearly for perhaps 20 miles on a good day, and even that limited range disappeared when pilots climbed to high altitude or encountered atmospheric interference. German aircraft radios were equally unreliable, forcing Luftwaffe pilots to rely on visual signals and predetermined flight plans that became useless the moment combat began in formations scattered across dozens of miles of sky. Chen's breakthrough came from abandoning the high-frequency radio bands that military planners had always used for aircraft communications. Instead of trying to push more power through frequencies that were naturally prone to static and interference, he designed his SCR 522 system around very high-frequency bands that carried voices with telephone clarity across distances that seemed magical compared to existing technology. The new radio could transmit crystal-clear conversations at ranges exceeding 200 miles, even when aircraft operated at maximum altitude where thin air had always made radio communication nearly impossible. The power difference between Chen's SCR 522 and existing military radios was staggering in both technical specifications and practical battlefield results. While German FUG-16 radios struggled to push 10 watts of transmission power through static-filled frequency bands, the SCR 522 generated 100 watts of clean signal that cut through atmospheric interference like a sword through paper. American test pilots reported being able to coordinate complex maneuvers with squadron mates flying beyond visual range, something that had never been possible in the history of military aviation. Production of the new radio system became a national priority that consumed resources and manufacturing capacity on a scale normally reserved for building entire aircraft. Bell Laboratories worked around the clock to produce 50,000 SCR 522 units, while German radio manufacturers managed to build only 5,000 of their inferior FUG-16 systems during the same period. American factory workers understood they were not just assembling electronic components, but forging weapons that would give their sons and brothers fighting overseas a technological edge that could mean the difference between coming home alive or dying in a foreign sky. The strategic implications of superior radio communication became clear during the first combat tests over the Pacific Theater. American P-38 squadrons equipped with SCR 522 radios could coordinate attacks with precision that transformed aerial combat from individual duels into orchestrated campaigns. Pilots reported being able to share target information, coordinate approach vectors, and execute complex tactical maneuvers that were impossible when each aircraft operated in isolation. Squadron commanders could direct multiple flights simultaneously, creating layered defenses and concentrated attacks that multiplied the effectiveness of every aircraft under their command. German intelligence officers analyzing American tactics began reporting disturbing patterns that suggested fundamental changes in how their enemies approached aerial warfare. Luftwaffe pilots described encounters with American formations that seemed to possess supernatural awareness of German positions and intentions. American aircraft appeared in perfect position to intercept German attacks, almost as if they could predict where the next assault would come from. German squadron leaders found their carefully planned attacks falling apart when American pilots coordinated defensive maneuvers with split-second timing that defied explanation. The contrast between American and German radio capabilities created a technological gap that grew wider with each passing month of war. While 94% of American P-38 squadrons received full radio coordination equipment, only 31% of German fighter units possessed even basic radio communication gear. American pilots trained extensively on radio discipline and coordination tactics, learning to fight as interconnected units rather than individual warriors. German pilots continued training for single combat scenarios that were rapidly becoming obsolete in a sky where their enemies shared information instantly across hundreds of miles. Chen's SCR 522 represented more than just improved radio technology. It embodied a fundamental shift from warfare based on individual skill and courage to warfare based on information sharing and coordinated action. The radio transformed each P-38 Lightning from an isolated fighting machine into a node in a vast network that could process battlefield information and coordinate responses faster than any human commander had ever imagined possible. American pilots were no longer fighting alone against the sky. They were fighting as components of a larger organism that could see farther, think faster, and strike with precision that turned aerial combat into a science rather than an art. Early 1944 brought a new chapter of aerial warfare to the Pacific Theater when Colonel Tom Anderson received orders that would test the full potential of radio-coordinated combat. Anderson had earned his nickname Radioman, not through any love of technology, but through his obsessive belief that information shared instantly between pilots could multiply their effectiveness beyond anything previously imagined in military aviation. His P-38 squadron had been selected to pioneer tactics that would transform 8 individual aircraft into a single fighting organism capable of protecting an entire bomber formation against overwhelming enemy numbers. The morning briefing revealed the scope of the challenge ahead. Intelligence reports indicated that Japanese Zero fighters were massing for a coordinated attack against a formation of B-24 bombers carrying critical supplies to Allied forces isolated on remote Pacific islands. The bombers would be flying at maximum range with minimal fuel reserves for evasive maneuvers, making them sitting targets for the highly maneuverable Japanese fighters. Anderson's 8 P-38 Lightnings represented the only protection for dozens of American aircrew and thousands of tons of desperately needed supplies. Anderson's innovation was deceptively simple in concept, but revolutionary in execution. Instead of assigning individual P-38 pilots to protect specific sections of the bomber formation, he created what he called the Lightning Network. Each pilot received constant updates on the position, altitude, speed, and ammunition status of every other aircraft in the formation. Radio operators continuously shared information about approaching threats, optimal intercept vectors, and coordinated maneuvers that would maximize defensive firepower while minimizing exposure to enemy attack. The Japanese assault began at dawn with 40 Zero fighters approaching from multiple directions in a classic pincer movement designed to overwhelm defensive capabilities through sheer numbers and simultaneous attacks. Under traditional tactics, each P-38 pilot would have engaged the nearest threat in individual combat, creating 8 separate dogfights scattered across dozens of miles of sky. Anderson's radio-coordinated approach transformed the defensive response into a choreographed performance where every pilot knew exactly where to be and when to be there. The Lightning Network's first test came when Japanese fighters attempted to break through the defensive perimeter by concentrating overwhelming force against a single section of the bomber formation. Anderson's voice cut through the radio frequency with calm precision that belied the life and death stakes of the moment. Thunder Flight, bandits approaching from 2 o'clock high. Execute layered defense pattern. Thunder 1 and 2, maintain high cover. Thunder 3 and 4, intercept at medium altitude. Thunder 5 and 6, swing wide for rear attack. Thunder 7 and 8, prepare to cover bombers if anyone breaks through. The coordinated response created a defensive barrier that seemed to anticipate every Japanese tactical move before it happened. When Zero fighters dove to attack the bombers, P-38 pilots were already positioned to intercept them at optimal firing angles. When Japanese pilots attempted to climb above the defensive formation, Other Lightnings were waiting at higher altitude with energy and position advantages that made successful attacks nearly impossible. The radio network allowed Anderson's pilots to share situational awareness that multiplied their effectiveness far beyond the sum of their individual capabilities. Across the Pacific, German air commanders studying reports of American tactics began to understand the magnitude of the technological revolution they were facing. Oberst Friedrich Lang, a veteran Luftwaffe strategist, analyzed combat reports with growing alarm as patterns emerged that challenged every assumption about aerial warfare. American formations were achieving kill ratios that seemed impossible under traditional combat principles. Single squadrons of P-38 fighters were defeating much larger German formations through coordination that appeared almost telepathic in its precision and timing. The statistical evidence painted a picture that German commanders found difficult to accept. P-38 squadrons using radio coordination were achieving kill ratios of 7 enemy aircraft destroyed for every Lightning lost, compared to traditional ratios of 2-to-1 that had been considered excellent throughout aviation history. The improvement could not be explained by superior pilot training, better aircraft performance, or more effective weapons. The only variable that correlated with American success was the presence of SCR 522 radio equipment and tactics that treated individual aircraft as components of larger fighting units. Lang's analysis revealed the fundamental problem facing German air forces. Luftwaffe pilots were still training for aerial combat as individual knights engaging in single combat, while their American enemies had evolved beyond individual warfare into something resembling a collective intelligence that could process information and coordinate responses faster than any human commander. German pilots fought with the courage and skill that had made them legendary, but courage and skill were becoming obsolete in a sky where enemies shared perfect information in real time. The transformation was complete when Anderson's Lightning network successfully protected the entire bomber formation without losing a single B-24 or P-38 to enemy action. The Japanese lost 19 Zero fighters in exchange for minor damage to 2 bombers that returned safely to base. Radio coordination had not just improved American tactical effectiveness. It had fundamentally changed the nature of aerial warfare from individual combat to networked operations that would define military aviation for decades to come. March 1945 brought the war to the skies over Berlin in what would become the largest coordinated P-38 Lightning formation in aviation history. 200 American fighters escorted heavy bombers toward the heart of Nazi Germany, while below them a nation fought its final desperate battle against inevitable defeat. Hauptmann Erich Müller, now bearing scars from 18 months of increasingly futile combat against radio-coordinated American formations, prepared to lead 150 German fighters in what everyone understood would be the Luftwaffe's last meaningful stand against Allied air superiority. The morning briefing at the German airfield carried an atmosphere of grim determination mixed with the unspoken knowledge that individual pilot skill could no longer overcome the technological advantages that American forces brought to every engagement. Müller had studied captured SCR 522 radio equipment for months, trying to understand how clear voice communication could transform aerial tactics so completely. German engineers had attempted to reverse engineer the American radio technology, but their copies produced only static and interference that made coordination impossible during the chaos of combat operations. The approaching American formation represented everything that German air commanders had learned to fear about radio-coordinated warfare. Colonel Anderson's Lightning network had evolved far beyond the 8 aircraft coordination of the previous year into something approaching a mechanical symphony where individual pilots executed maneuvers with precision that seemed choreographed by some invisible conductor. American pilots no longer flew as individuals supporting each other, but as components of a larger organism that processed battlefield information and responded to threats with inhuman efficiency and timing. The engagement began when German fighters climbed to intercept altitude and immediately encountered defensive patterns that had been refined through months of combat experience. American pilots executing what Anderson called the symphony formation maintained constant radio communication that allowed them to coordinate maneuvers across the entire 200-aircraft formation. Lead pilots called out threat vectors, altitude changes, and tactical adjustments that rippled through the formation like electrical impulses through a nervous system, creating defensive responses that adapted to German attacks faster than human reaction time should have allowed. Muller found himself leading his fighters into a battle that felt fundamentally different from every previous aerial engagement he had experienced during 5 years of war. German pilots flew with the same courage and skill that had made them legendary during the early years of conflict, but they fought as isolated individuals, while their American enemies shared perfect situational awareness through radio networks that turned each Lightning into a sensor and weapon system for the entire formation. When German fighters concentrated their attack against one section of the American formation, other P-38 squadrons maneuvered to support the threatened area with coordination that seemed to anticipate German tactical moves before they happened. The radio chatter from American pilots demonstrated a level of tactical sophistication that German commanders had never encountered in previous warfare. P-38 pilots shared altitude, speed, ammunition status, fuel remaining, and target acquisition data in real time while maintaining defensive formations that maximized their collective firepower. German pilots could hear fragments of American radio transmissions that revealed coordination extending beyond individual squadrons to encompass the entire bomber escort mission, creating layered defenses that made successful attacks nearly impossible. The turning point came when Muller finally understood the true scope of what radio coordination meant for the future of aerial warfare. American pilots were not just talking to each other during combat. They were sharing a collective awareness that allowed 200 individual aircraft to function as a single fighting unit capable of processing threats and coordinating responses faster than any traditional military formation. The Americans had not simply improved their radio equipment. They had evolved beyond individual combat into networked warfare that would define military aviation for generations. The battle's conclusion painted a stark picture of how technological advancement could render traditional military skills obsolete regardless of the courage and dedication of individual warriors. 89 German fighters fell to American guns while only 12 P-38 Lightnings were lost, creating kill ratios that demonstrated the overwhelming advantage of coordinated tactics over individual pilot ability. Muller survived the engagement with his aircraft damaged, and his understanding of aerial warfare forever changed by witnessing the power of connected military operations. As surviving German pilots limped back to their bases through skies that now belonged entirely to radio-coordinated American formations, the lesson became clear to everyone who had participated in the day's fighting. The age of individual aerial combat had ended not through lack of courage or skill among German pilots, but through technological evolution that made traditional tactics as obsolete as cavalry charges against machine gun positions. Radio coordination had transformed aerial warfare from individual duels between knights into industrial operations where information sharing and coordinated action determined victory more surely than pilot training or aircraft performance. The silence that followed the battle carried more meaning than any words could convey as German air commanders understood that they had been fighting yesterday's war with yesterday's tactics, while their enemies had already begun fighting tomorrow's conflicts with technology and coordination that represented the future of military aviation. The war ended with unconditional German surrender on May 8, 1945, but the true scope of the P-38 Lightning's radio advantage only became clear during post-war analysis conducted by Colonel Anderson and his team of aviation experts. Sitting in a quiet office at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in 1946, Anderson reviewed combat reports that painted a stunning picture of how superior communication technology had transformed the entire nature of aerial warfare. The statistics revealed that radio coordination had been responsible for 68% of Allied air superiority success, making the SCR-522 radio system more decisive than any new aircraft design, engine improvement, or weapons advancement developed during the conflict. The most remarkable testimony came from former enemies who had experienced radio-coordinated tactics from the receiving end of coordinated attacks. Hauptmann Erich Muller, now a prisoner of war being interviewed by American intelligence officers, provided insights that confirmed what Allied commanders had suspected about the psychological impact of fighting against networked opponents. Muller's words carried the weight of hard-earned experience when he explained that German pilots had not simply been outfought by superior individual skill or better aircraft performance. They had been systematically defeated by coordination that made American formations fight like single organisms rather than collections of individual pilots. Muller's analysis cut to the heart of why traditional aerial combat tactics had become obsolete almost overnight when radio coordination entered the battlefield. German pilots had trained for individual combat scenarios where success depended on personal skill, aircraft performance, and tactical awareness that each pilot developed through experience and intuition. American pilots using SCR 522 radios shared collective awareness that multiplied their individual capabilities and allowed them to execute maneuvers that would have been impossible without instant communication across entire formations. The technological gap had created a fundamental shift in military thinking that would influence warfare for decades to come. The legacy of the P-38's radio advantage extended far beyond World War II into conflicts that would define the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. Vietnam War pilots used radio coordination principles developed during Lightning Network operations to coordinate air support missions with ground forces, creating integrated operations that treated aircraft as extensions of infantry units rather than independent fighting forces. The Gulf War demonstrated how satellite communication systems could extend P-38 radio coordination concepts across global distances, allowing commanders to coordinate air operations spanning multiple continents with precision that Anderson could never have imagined during his pioneering work in the Pacific Theater. Modern drone warfare represents the ultimate evolution of coordination principles first demonstrated by P-38 Lightning squadrons during World War II. Unmanned aircraft operating in coordinated swarms share information and coordinate attacks using communication systems that trace their conceptual origins directly back to Chen's SCR 522 radio breakthrough at Bell Telephone Laboratories. Contemporary military planners studying Ukrainian drone operations against Russian forces observe coordination patterns that mirror Anderson's Lightning Network tactics, proving that the fundamental principles of networked warfare remain constant even as technology evolves from analog radio systems to digital satellite networks spanning the entire globe. The human cost of technological revolution became clear when former Luftwaffe pilots like Muller transitioned from enemies to advisors helping Allied forces understand how communication advantages could be maintained and improved for future conflicts. Muller's post-war career involved teaching American pilots about German tactical approaches and explaining how radio coordination had neutralized traditional fighter tactics that had dominated aerial warfare since the invention of military aviation. His unique perspective, as someone who had experienced both sides of the technological divide, provided insights that helped Allied air forces develop training programs for the jet age and beyond. The broader lesson of the P-38 Lightning's radio advantage transcended military applications to influence civilian aviation, emergency services, and communication technology development throughout the remainder of the 20th century. Commercial airlines adopted radio coordination principles to manage increasingly complex air traffic systems, while emergency responders used similar coordination concepts to manage disaster relief operations that required multiple agencies to work together seamlessly. The same basic insight that had made Anderson's Lightning Network so effective in combat proved equally valuable for any situation requiring multiple independent units to function as coordinated